2020-30 Disability Network Southwest Michigan, the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. In celebration of the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Disability Network Southwest Michigan has produced this timeline documenting important events in the history of the disability rights movement in the United States. We hope you will join our celebration by sharing your vision for the next 30 years of disability history. 1945, first curb cuts. Image, black and white photo of woman walking up a curb ramp in downtown Kalamazoo. In 1945, Battle Creek, Michigan installed accessible curb cuts around the Percy Jones Army Hospital and then in the downtown area, becoming the first city in the nation to have curb cuts. Jack Fisher, a veteran who had received treatment at the hospital and lived in Kalamazoo, petitioned the Kalamazoo City Commission to install curb cuts. City manager Edward Clark, whose son used a wheelchair, thought it was a great idea and began installing curb cuts with metal handrails throughout downtown Kalamazoo. Curb cuts wouldn't appear elsewhere in the United States until 30 years later in Berkeley, California. 1959, Ed Roberts denied a diploma. Image, black and white photo of Ed Roberts in a wheelchair. In 1959, Ed Roberts, who was quadriplegic as a result of childhood polio, was denied a high school diploma because he had not completed his physical education and driver's training requirements. Roberts successfully advocated for his right to receive a high school diploma and went on to the University of California, Berkeley, where he continued his disability advocacy work. Today, Roberts is known as the father of the disability rights movement. 1968, Architectural Barriers Act. Image, stairs and ramp leading to a building entrance. The Architectural Barriers Act, or ABA, enacted on August 12, 1968, requires that facilities designed, built, altered, or leased using U.S. federal funds be accessible to people with disabilities. The ABA marks one of the first efforts to ensure that buildings and facilities are designed and constructed to be accessible to people with disabilities. 1971, first CIL established. Image, black and white photo of people with disabilities at a meeting. Ed Roberts and his colleagues opened the first Center for Independent Living, or CIL, in Berkeley, California. Today, there are more than 400 CILs nationwide. Disability Network Southwest Michigan and Disability Network Southwest Michigan Barry and Cass are two of the 15 CILs in the state of Michigan. 1973, the Rehabilitation Act. Image, black and white photo of protesters with disabilities. In 1973, Congress passed the Rehabilitation Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs conducted by or funded by federal agencies. The requirements of the Rehabilitation Act were stated so broadly that enforcement was difficult. Subsequent regulations provided guidelines for enforcement. 1974, the end of ugly laws. Image, black and white photo of woman with a visible disability affecting her right eye. In 1974, the last of the ugly laws was eliminated. Until then, ugly laws had allowed the police to arrest and jail people with visible disabilities for being seen in public. 1975, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Image, student with Down syndrome doing schoolwork. The Education for Handicapped Children Act of 1975, now called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, was signed into law. The law requires a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment for all children with disabilities. 1977, the 504 sit-in. Image, black and white photo of protesters at the 504 sit-in. The 504 sit-in demonstrations began on April 5, 1977, demanding that the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, or HEW, sign off on regulations for Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, so the act could be enforced. Sit-ins occurred in a number of cities across the United States, including a 28-day sit-in at the Federal Building in San Francisco. After HEW cut off phone service to the building, deaf members of the protest used sign language from the windows to coordinate with allies outside. Activists from the Black Panthers provided food for the demonstrators during the 4 weeks they spent in the building, and the San Francisco mayor's office provided inflatable mattresses, portable showers, and new payphones. The 28-day occupation of the San Francisco Federal Building remains the longest-lasting act of civil disobedience in U.S. history. As a result of the 504 sit-ins, the Secretary of HEW signed the 504 regulations on April 28, 1977. 1978, Denver Transit Protest. Image, black and white photo of protesters in wheelchairs surrounding a bus. On July 5, 1978, disability rights activists from ADAPT physically blocked several public buses from continuing their routes in downtown Denver. The Gang of 19, as they became known, were protesting the lack of accessible public transportation. This protest gained national attention and raised awareness of the lack of access and opportunities for people with disabilities. ADAPT activists continue to be at the forefront of the disability rights movement today. 1986, Air Carrier Access Act. Image, TSA agent adjusting the footrest on a traveler's wheelchair. In 1986, the Air Carrier Access Act was implemented, prohibiting discrimination by domestic or foreign air carriers against individuals with physical or mental disabilities. The Act requires that all air carriers provide boarding assistance and accessibility features in newly built aircrafts and airports. 1988, Deaf President Now. Image, protesters waving colorful flags behind a banner that says Deaf President Now. In March of 1988, students and faculty of Gallaudet University, a school for deaf people in Washington, D.C., staged a large-scale protest demanding that the school board hire a deaf person as president of the university. Under pressure from the protest and the media attention it was receiving, the school named I. King Jordan as the first deaf president of Gallaudet. 1990, the Capitol Crawl. Image, protesters with disabilities crawling up the steps of the U.S. Capitol. On March 12, 1990, more than 1,000 disability rights protesters came to Washington, D.C. to urge Congress to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act. To demonstrate the barriers confronting people with disabilities, more than 60 activists abandoned their mobility devices and began crawling up the 83 stone steps that lead to the Capitol. There was no accessible entrance to the Capitol building at the time. 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Image, President George H.W. Bush signing the Americans with Disabilities Act. On July 26, 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, into law. The ADA is considered to be the most important civil rights law since Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and provides comprehensive civil rights protection for people with disabilities. 1999, Olmsted Decision. Image, person in a wheelchair holding up a sign that says, I am Olmsted. On June 22, 1999, the U.S. Supreme Court found in the case of Olmsted v. LC that unjustified segregation of persons with disabilities constitutes discrimination in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. This landmark case ensured that people with disabilities would receive services in the most integrated and least restrictive environment possible. 2002 Help America Vote Act. Image: red, white, and blue campaign buttons that say vote. The Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, was passed in 2002. It requires that all polling places have voting systems accessible for all people with disabilities. 2006 Internet Accessibility Enforced. Image: logos for Target and the National Federation of the Blind. In 2006, the National Federation of the Blind sued Target Corporation for having an inaccessible website, which they deemed to be in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Courts ruled that Target's website must be accessible to people with disabilities because it is a public accommodation. This was the first legal case to challenge the accessibility of Internet content. 2008 ADA Amendments Act. Image: President George W. Bush signing the ADA Amendments Act. On September 25, 2008, the Americans with Disabilities Act Amendments Act of 2008, or ADAAA, was signed by President George W. Bush. The ADAAA broadened the interpretation of the ADA, making it easier for an individual seeking protection under the ADA to establish that they have a disability. 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design. Image: cover page that says ADA in Details, Interpreting the 2010 Americans with Disabilities Act Standards for Accessible Design. On September 15, 2010, the Department of Justice published revised regulations for Titles II and III of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which created enforceable accessibility standards called the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design. 2010 Rosa's Law. Image: President Obama standing with Rosa Marcelino and her family. Signed into law by President Barack Obama on September 22, 2010, Rosa's Law removes the terms mentally retarded and mental retardation from federal health, education, and labor policy and replaces them with person-first language, individual with an intellectual disability, and intellectual disability. The law is named after Rosa Marcelino, a young activist with Down syndrome who advocated for the law, which was passed when she was 9 years old. 2012 Online Closed Captions Enforced. Image: screen displaying logos for multiple video streaming applications. In 2012, in a lawsuit brought by the National Association of the Deaf against Netflix, a federal judge ruled that Netflix and all other online video providers must offer closed captioning on all programming. The disability revolution continues. Image: wheelchair user boarding Amtrak train using a ramp. The fight for disability rights continues. Here are just a few of the challenges activists are currently working on: accessible passenger boarding on Amtrak, Air Carrier Access Act regulations on service animals and emotional support animals, use of audio description in movies and open captions in movie theaters, and adequate funding for mental health and home and community-based services, or HCBS. What will the future hold? Image: protesters holding signs that say, "Disability rights are human rights," and "Shut down ableism." Thank you for joining us for this historical view of the disability rights movement. We invite you to think about what events you would like to see moving forward on this timeline. What changes do you want to see over the next 30 years of disability history? Share your ideas with us. We want to hear from you.